All righty. Good morning, everybody. All right, just getting some stuff set up here. If you are joining us this morning, this beautiful Monday morning, welcome. If you are watching this at some other time, hope you're having a lovely day or had a lovely day. Yeah, so we're diving in. It is February here in 2021. And we kind of spent the last month kind of going over analog workflows, just kind of like analog gear, outboard versus plugins, etc., gain staging into analog stuff. And now it's time to start working on building a mix. So that's kind of what we're going to be looking at today is how to start setting up in your DAW, how to kind of get yourself gain staged properly and start looking at building a mix from scratch with all of the tracks that you might have, and just kind of starting to build something from the start. So let's go in and take a look at what we have. So I've got Pro Tools pulled up here with some tracks already loaded in. So as you can see here, we've got, all of our drums here in red, a bass guitar in orange, guitars here in green, and then we have some printed effects that we did while we were tracking this. So very, very basic setup here. And as you can see, everything that I've brought in, you're dealing with here, just your standard stuff. Nothing's panned. Everything here is at unity right now. So we haven't gain stage. We haven't touched anything yet. So we're just working with what we have here. So what I'll do with these, I will go ahead and basically just kind of play this track to see where everything is sitting. And then from there, we can then take a listen and start to look at how we're going to build this up. So here it is. All right, so it actually sounds pretty good as it is. Definitely not going to lie there. Now, granted, this was something that we tracked, so we did kind of proper gain staging and stuff when we were actually recording this, so it sounds pretty good. But there are some things that we can start leveling out and getting to sound a little bit better. But all in all, it's pretty much there. So this kind of leads me to my first thing of when you're recording, to kind of like, especially this when we're recording a full band, is getting your gain stage proper when you're coming in will actually make your life a little bit easier on the other side when you start to mix. But like I said, there are some things that we can start looking at. So let's start here. First I'm actually going to pull down all of our faders here, and I'm going to start from scratch. So now when I hit play, which as you can see, it is playing, we can't hear anything. In fact, what I'll do here, we're going to go to pre-fader metering so you can see things are playing. We're not hearing anything out of Pro Tools. We're just literally seeing the levels move. So when I start working, I typically start with drums. Drums tend to be kind of like, I think of them as your foundation, right? They're not only like your metronome or your click track or your rhythmic section, but it also is kind of just your foundation where everything kind of either builds around or sits around. Now, granted, say if this had a vocal track, vocals would be our center point usually, unless there's a guitar solo or something. But it is nice to have kind of like a bed to lay everything out on and around, and we can do a lot with the drums. Plus, not to mention they're the most microphones as well. You know, when we look here in the session, we've got a single track for bass, 3 for guitars, some effects here, and then the rest is all drums. So we do have a lot to deal with our drums. I mean, we've got, looks like 14 tracks here. So it is nice to kind of start with the most. So let's dive in and start looking at this. So now this is the way I do it. It doesn't necessarily mean that you need to do it this way. I just find this works best for me. And I like to think and work kind of, I guess, from the outside in, if that makes sense. So when we're dealing with instruments, particularly like drums, guitars, etc., those instruments we hear in a space, right? When we are working or listening to instruments in a live situation, we're not up with our ear on the drum set on the floor tom saying, oh man, that floor tom sounds great. We are typically further back, you know, away from the drummer, and we're hearing the drummer in a space. So when I start to work and to build, especially with a drum kit, I will try and work with that, with a room or an overhead to start. So I don't go in and start pulling up my individual mics, because I am looking for an overall sound. I'm looking for something that's going to encompass the sound of the drums in its entirety, and then I'm going to sweeten or accentuate specific items with those close mics. So for example, we bring up the overheads, which encompasses the entire sound of the drum set, and then I will start to bring in the kick and the snare and the toms so I can accentuate those elements of the entirety of the kit. So that's where we're going to start. So let's go ahead and look, and so we've got our overheads right here. So I am just going to hit play. Let's see, actually let's make sure we're in a spot where the drums are in, so we'll come in right here. Okay, so now I'm going to start bringing these up. So let's go ahead and bring up our overheads. Also just kind of watching the levels to make sure that they are pretty much even, so I do get an even spread there. So there's our overhead sound. So now I'm going to bring up our room sound, but I'm going to make some adjustments here on the room. So first thing I'm going to do, like if I pop these up, for example, let's solo these up. So you can barely hear anything going on there, right? There's a reason for that. This is a mid-side room technique that we recorded. So in other words, we had a microphone recording the mids, and then we had a figure of 8 mic recording the sides. And then on those sides, I actually took one and I reversed the polarity. So I flipped it out of phase. So that the one microphone picking up the sides, the same signal is going, and I flipped it so it kind of cancels itself out. It doesn't quite cancel out completely because I do have compression going on, so there is a little non-linearities there, but it's pretty much, you get the idea here. So I'm going to bring up the mids here. The mids is what we're going to hear the most. So we're basically just hearing the mids there because we haven't done any panning yet. So I'm going to actually go ahead and leave these as they are. I'm not going to touch them, but what I am going to do, now that I've got my overheads and say my rooms here, we're going to make these into groups. So I'm just going to pull these up. So I've got my create group here. So I've got my overheads in here, and I'm just going to name this OH for overheads. Same thing, I'm going to grab these, and we're going to go and call this rooms. Now, the whole reason behind grouping these is now when I go to move the fader, you can see all of them move at once, which is really, really nice. So now I can actually turn these down to a level that I want them. So I will go ahead and bring these down. Okay, so let's see what we've got so far. with, oops, let me go ahead and, yeah, okay, here we go. I'm just going to go ahead and take the rooms in and out here. Now, again, we are in mono, so you're not hearing too much of a difference there, but we'll get to that. So, again, so we've kind of started with basically everything that encompasses our drum kit, right? So we've started with the overheads, the rooms, so anything that picks up the entirety of the kit. And now from here, we can kind of start building all of the extra little pieces. So let's kind of start adding some of these in. Okay, let's jump to a spot where there are toms. Actually, let's come back here. Okay, so we've got a basic mix going on. So now the question is, how do I know if it's too loud or too quiet, or what do I need to do for these drums? So we've got everything, as you can see. We just have our kick, our snare, our toms, our worst mic, which we can talk about this in a little bit, as well as like this, our hi-hat ride, overheads, rooms. So everything's going. So I'm going to scroll down to here, and I just have this compressor sitting on the mix bus. So everything, this is what everything is coming to. So let's take a look at what's happening. Okay, so you can see we're just touching it. You can see kind of where the levels were sitting here on the submaster and the master. So you kind of get an idea of where I'm sitting these drums. One of the great things right now with all these streaming services, it's kind of changed the dynamics that we can print when we're sending out mixes. So all throughout, let's say like from 60s, 70s, 80s, we were able to have, or we had a lot of these like super dynamic mixes, right? So things that are super quiet, things that are super loud. As the late 80s, 90s, and 2000s came along, we got into basically trying to make things louder and louder and louder for the radio, which of course squishing our dynamic range. So the quietest things and the loudest things, there was less range between them, compressing things down. Well, now with streaming services starting to kind of normalize things due to a perceived loudness, things can start to open back up a little bit. We can start to get more dynamic with things. So we can have, quiet things and loud things, and the separation can be a little bit more anymore. So we're starting to normalize this kind of thought process, which is really great. So I tend to try and go for kind of more of a punchy sound when I come to my drums. And you can kind of see where things were hitting. They were hitting, under here, beneath clipping, just a little bit. Now, of course, and we can even see numbers here, like almost -3, basically. This is just something that you kind of learn as you do this over and over and over. There are no set levels. It's not like I go in and say I know exactly where I'm going to set my levels every time. I have an idea for sure because I've done this over and over and over. But in general, of course, close mics a little bit higher up. I keep my overheads in my rooms a little bit down, and then like that when I'm getting into cymbals and things, I typically have them pulled down a little more as well. So that's pretty much how I run it. So if you look here, You can see the rooms, the overheads here, and then here's my cymbals, here's my toms, and then my kick and my snare. So they're kind of within a range, basically, and this also depends on how it's recorded as well. So that makes a huge difference. So, but this gives you a rough idea. And this is why I personally like having a compressor plug-in just kind of sitting here. Even if I don't end up using it when I send something out, this gives me a really great idea of where my mix is sitting, basically, to make sure that I'm not hitting too hard. So I'll hit play again. Okay, yeah, so you can see it. I'm just hitting between 1 to 3 dB on the compressor. The threshold's set at -15, like that. I wasn't clipping. We're sitting about -3 on the dBFS, so full scale, so before I actually clip and hit the red. So yeah, everything's looking pretty good. So this is my good foundation. Again, we haven't panned anything yet. We haven't opened anything up. This is all mono. So now we can start looking at some other instruments. So let's go ahead and bring in the bass. The bass is a good one to lock in with the drums because we're typically dealing with the kick and the bass locking in together. So we can kind of just bring that in and try and get it sitting and feeling right and sounding right. That way we can still hear the punch of the kick, but we still get all the growl and the low thump from the bass. So let's bring it in. Okay, so again, just going to make sure like that you can still hear the punch, but we can still feel the rumble or hear the rumble of that bass. So let's see if that made any difference to our compressor here. So our compressor really isn't moving any differently, but let's go ahead and now look at the submaster over here. So if you were watching the submaster, when I took the bass out, all of a sudden our green basically dropped down here a little bit, and then when I brought it back in, it raised up here. So what does this mean, or what am I looking at, or what am I trying to do? So bass guitar is not a percussive instrument, and the way I have the compressor set up on here is I'm actually capturing or looking to contain the percussive instruments. So the drums, right? The things that have transients, the very, very fast attacked instruments that have like a blip basically, and where a bass is very, it's a very sturdy and kind of rounded instrument in its sound, and that it does have, of course, some dynamics to it, but it's more of kind of like, almost looks like a brick waveform, especially once you add a little bit of compression for a bass. That's kind of what happens. So the bass, in essence, you could almost think of it as like an RMS instrument. So like basically the level is averaged out. So instruments like this, pads, strings, keys, pianos, depending on the type that they are and how they're played, those instruments add to the average level. So they don't add to the percussiveness, but they bring up the average level of things. So they kind of sit and they just kind of like float, basically, is a great way to think about this. So now this can get into arrangement ideas too, but understand that, setting your levels of your percussive instruments, they're going to poke through and poke over your average instrument levels. So then you can start to kind of work or figure out what these different elements are doing and how to use them to build the song. So, all right, so let's take a look back in now at the guitar. So we've got basically a DI and then 2 mics. So let's listen to those just as they are real quick. I'm just going to solo up the guitar DI here. Okay, so there's our DI. Let's listen to our guitar mics. You can kind of hear one's a little bit brighter than the other, and you've got a lot of that attack. So the DI, we're not going to probably mess with at the moment. We're going to leave that, but we do have, of course, the other guitars. So let's go ahead and see my D here. I'm just going to set these, and now I'm going to do something kind of fun here. So we've got our 2 guitar mics. They were miking the same exact instrument, the same speaker, right? So they should be in phase. So if I pull in a plugin that has the ability to reverse the phase right here, if I can phase reverse, now I can basically set the levels of these guitars by flipping one out of phase. So let's go ahead and play, and I'll solo these up. And I'm actually going to jump back here at the beginning just to give us something a little different to listen to. Okay, now I'm going to flip it out of phase. We're going to listen to it. So you can hear how some of that goes away. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mess with the fader to see if I can find a blend that I like when I'm out of phase, where the most stuff is canceling out, okay? That's kind of what I'm shooting for here. So nothing's really canceling out. I mean, the top end is a little bit. So let's go in and let's take a look at what's actually happening here on the guitar mics, because there might be something going on here in the phase. So let's take a look and see. Let's get rid of this for a minute. And let's blow these up just a little bit more. So here we'll come back to the very, very beginning. So I'm just kind of looking at these basically to see if they line up. That's kind of what I'm searching for here, which they're close, but they're not quite there. And you can also see we're dealing with different frequencies as well. Now, granted, they were grabbing different parts of the speaker, and we're also emulating different microphones, or have different microphones here. So, they're not 100% perfect. So So you kind of hear I adjusted a little bit. So I'm going to move it back. Let's do something like this. So what I'm going to do, so I'm going to use some Pro Tools stuff here, but you can pretty much do this in any DAW, but I'm going to basically tab or find the transient or the first percussive hit of each microphone, and then I'm going to try to align these via what Pro Tools is finding for me. So let's go ahead and jump in, look, and so I'm going to go ahead, we'll do this. So basically I'm just tabbing to the transient, and I'm cutting where Pro Tools thinks that it's starting. Now, isn't that interesting? It shows that these are perfectly in line. So I'm going to undo for a second. Let's go to the next transient. Let's see what it says here. Okay, so this one shows a little bit off. So let's go ahead. I'm going to pull this one back like that. And then I'm just going to do that. All right, so let's see if that's changed the sound. Okay, so you kind of hear what's going on there, right? Again, I'm kind of looking for a spot where it's sounding like I'm losing the most of the sound. You know, I'm losing a lot of the guitar. Here we can also look at the levels too. Okay, so again, we're listening to the differences. So when I have the phase flipped, it's canceling out anything that is similar, right? Anything that's going to be the same. So if that sound, if you know, when we're in phase and we're listening, if that's the sound we're going for, you know, that's typically you lose like the mids and the lows, you know, and stuff like that. So you're hearing when I have the phase actually flipped, we're hearing all those kind of bitey highs, and there definitely are still some lows going on in there too. So when I take this out of phase, or sorry, back into normal phase, so we're not flipping or reversing the phase on anything, or flipping the polarity, everything kind of all that mid-range and stuff comes back. All that kind of like vocal area of the guitar comes back. And that's of course what we want. So, you know, depending on how a guitar is mic'd, so especially if you're using two mics, we can actually adjust or change what frequencies we're getting rid of. So for example, again, like if I play this again, those really like harsh, like piercing upper highs up there, those disappear when I actually put things back into phase, because that's what's getting canceled out. It's like all that information's going away, and it's, you know, we may not want that sound anyway, so we get more of like that warmer, more bodied tone when we put this back out of the phase flip and into zero, so it's off, so we're back in phase and our waveforms are moving together, which is what we want anyway. So you can adjust the faders, the levels, when you're out of phase, to try and find the stuff that you probably don't like or don't want. And then of course you can flip it back, and then everything that you do want will come back and sound great. So we kind of have the levels set where we want them. So I'm going to get rid of this plugin. And same thing, I'm going to group these up, and I'm just going to call it, guitar for now. Okay, so now that I've got my level set and my group set, and I can actually move them together, we can now bring this into the mix. So let's go ahead and jump into a spot that we like with everything. Cool. It's looking and sounding good. So we've basically just kind of gain staged ourselves here at this point. So we haven't done any kind of panning, and I, of course, haven't brought the effects in yet either. All I've done is basically set levels. That's all we've done. We've just basically kind of redesigned the mix from where it was and just kind of set the levels of everything to kind of sound the way that we're looking for, right? To get the balance of the volumes. Now, I did all of this in mono. So everything is up to center, and the reason for that is I'm looking to kind of also start to understand what's happening or what's getting masked. So when we have multiple instruments, a lot of instruments can actually talk over each other. For example, they share a lot of similar frequency spectrums or frequency range. So from 20 hertz all the way up to 20K, instruments will overlap each other in those ranges. So what we basically start getting is masking, where one instrument is going to be heard over the other depending on the volume of it, and it's going to start kind of like stacking or building up and can actually start muddying up things or making them sound not as good. So what I'm basically looking to do here is trying to find a level where I can still pretty much hear anything and everything that's going on without too much masking. However, if we say we had a bunch of stuff going on, we might definitely hear masking, in which case then we can start making a plan of how we're going to move forward, not only in panning, because panning will also help us start to spread those frequency ranges out and open up the mix more. Because again, if everything's here, and we start panning things around, we're going to hear them in different spaces, in different areas of the mix, in our 180 degree that we can hear. So we can start opening things up that way, or then beyond that, we can start looking at EQ to actually start carving out sections. It's like, oh, well, this instrument doesn't really need this low mid, but the bass needs to sit there instead, and so we can start carving things out that way as well. But if we get our levels set first, just so we can kind of pretty much hear anything and everything, that's a really great start, because now, again, as we pan and then eventually once we EQ, things will continue to open up more and more and more. So bringing everything up just full bore isn't always the best. We want to actually set the levels so, again, we can kind of hear the details of things. So let's dive in again and look, or actually I should say listen here to everything that we've got going on. Let me do one thing here. There we go. Okay. You can still hear the kick, the punch of the kick coming through the bass, but you can hear the bass kind of filling up around. You hear the snare, you hear the hi-hats, you hear the cymbals. Granted, we didn't get to the toms yet, but you can hear all the parts of the guitar. Now, of course, if there are more instruments, let's say we added keys to this and vocals and pads and etc., there's just more stuff to kind of build in. But the same thing applies, where all we really need to do with that is basically just kind of fit it into the mix, right? We're just pushing it into an area and making it sound the way we want it to sound. So from here, let's go ahead and look at some panning while we're in here. So when it comes to panning, there's a few ways to think about this. And this also kind of depends on how you want them to sound. But typically, I'd say 99% of the time, when we're panning, we're thinking about how we're looking at it from the perspective of an audience member. Now, not always. There are definitely a lot of mixes and a lot of tutorials that I find out there that are actually reversed, and specifically talking about drums, for example, where usually if it's a drummer um, that's doing a mix, for example, a lot of times they're used to sitting behind the kit, for example. So if if I'm sitting behind the kit, I've got the snare drum in front of me, I've got my tom here, maybe another tom here, another tom down here, kick, my hi-hat, my ride, etc. Now, for you as an audience member looking at me, so to me, of course, this is on my right-hand side for my ride, but for you looking at me, it's on your left. So some people will pan drums as if they're sitting behind the drum set. The thing that I find, or the issue that I find with this, as a viewer, it gets really weird when I hear them going around the toms, and I'm physically looking at them going around, but the audio is going the opposite way. It gets a little funky for me, so I typically try to mix things from an audience perspective, because most of us aren't up on stage playing with the band, hearing the same thing. We're instead watching the band play, and we're hearing everything coming from the stage, so we're watching them like that. We're watching them play the toms around. We're not sitting behind the drum set. So I will typically pan things from the audience perspective. Now, of course, this doesn't mean it's the best way or the right way or the wrong way or etc. It just is the way that I like to pan things, to kind of accentuate the feeling that you're sitting there watching this music happen. Now, of course, you could argue the opposite. If you wanted to be immersed into the sound, you could technically pan things from the drummer's perspective, so your sounds like you're sitting on stage with everyone playing around you. You're more than welcome to do that as well. But again, this is just how I particularly like to do this, to pan things. So, first thing I'm going to look at here is our rooms. Now, remember, I had said that our room left and right here, these two, that they're out of phase, and we really can't hear them because right now they're centered up and we're not hearing what we really need to be hearing. Granted, like that, you can hear the compression going on. It's very slight, but let's pan these out. Okay, sounds kind of funky, right? Because their phase is flipped. So if you're listening on a mono speaker, you might not have heard any change whatsoever. But most likely, if you're listening with headphones or speakers, or something like that is in stereo, now of course you're hearing it, and it sounds weird. It just sounds funky, right? It's like kind of just makes you go, "Oh, what's wrong with that sound?" So now I'm going to bring in. Let me kind of set these up real quick. I'm going to bring in our mid here. So this is our middle sound. So by adding in that mid, of course, it starts to bring up the body, and everything starts to sound right again. It starts to sound like a room. And if you notice, the more I push it, the more everything seems to come into the center, and then the more I pull it down, the more things start to spread apart. So this is one of my favorite techniques with this miking style, with mid-side for drum room, is we can actually adjust the width of the drums basically with one fader. Once we have our left and right up, we can adjust the mid to get a more centered sound or a wider sound, just by moving one fader. And of course, if this does go down into mono for any reason, then the sides completely should basically null each other out, and then all we're getting is that mid mic anyway, but we'll still have a room sound with that. So really neat technique, which we will probably go over at some point. But that sounds great. It's a nice room. So let's move on. Let's now look at our overheads here. Now, immediately you'll notice this is a very much closer sound, right? The rooms were definitely, you could tell that it was in the room, it was further away. These definitely make it sound like we're right on top of the drum set. Okay, so what I did there is I took the overhead that was sitting over the hi-hat and I panned it to the right, and I took the overhead over the ride side of the kit and panned it to the left. Because again, looking at an audience perspective, if I am the drummer, my hi-hat is here, which of course I am panning one way, and then my ride is over here, which is getting panned the other way. So you can kind of understand, like looking at me, why I'm panning things a specific way, because again, to you, this is your right side, this is your left side, which is opposite for me. So I'm panning opposite what I'd be playing from behind the drums to give you a sense of what's going on. So now, like if I'm sitting here playing the hi-hat here, you're going to hear it in the proper ear. You get the idea, right? So I'm just playing through those. So we've got that panned. Now, I didn't pan these 100%. I could definitely open these up. But now we're getting to basically discuss space and how we use space, because there's a few different options that we have. But in general, I typically, again, thinking of it from outside in, if the room is what we're in, the room should be the widest thing. And then we come down, the drums with the overheads are the next thing. And then beyond that, we've got, all of our individual elements. So I'm literally, the room is the widest into the overheads and then down into everything else. So I'm kind of working down. So same idea of like how I built my mix, right? Where I built it from the room, because that's what we hear the most, and then kind of brought it in to the accentuated parts. The same idea applies here. When I'm panning, I want my rooms to be the largest and then come in a little bit slightly. Not to mention, I want to leave room for other things. Now, I could just continue panning things out 100%, and there are definitely mixers and engineers that do that. It's typically they call it like LCR. If you've ever heard of it, it's LCR, left, center, and right. Or for you, I guess it would be left, center, and right. But you get the idea that you're either panning it to the left, you're panning it to the right, or you're centering something up. Now, this was because old analog desks, some of them you had to actually engage an actual pan pot in order to pan things, and it would change the sound. So they didn't like to use it, so they either just went left, they pushed the button for left, they pushed the button for right, or they pushed both to center it up. So I try, because we're in the digital world, to pan things all throughout the spectrum, right? So in Pro Tools, for example, it's 100 to 0 to 100. So we have that full range. So, and it goes in increments of 1. In other DAWs, it may be like plus 54 to negative 53 or something along those lines. But in essence, we have an entire stereo spectrum to work with. So we have the far left and far right, where if something is panned 100%, it only comes out of one speaker. Or if, and then as we start moving, it slowly starts bringing that level into the other speaker until we're at 0, which it comes out equally of both speakers. And then from there, of course, we can go the opposite way. So to demonstrate that, I'm just going to grab this mic, for example, on the drums. And I'm going to start at the left, and I'm going to pan it around. So you should have been able to hear that, right, as I'm panning back and forth. Again, if you're on a mono system, got to get some headphones or some speakers and listen to really hear that, what's happening. But as I slowly gained up, it slowly starts to add a little bit of that sound in the other speaker, and it starts to come around till all of a sudden we're centered, and it's coming equally out of both, and then we start going the opposite way, and then this other speaker starts to go down as we're panning it this way. So there's a lot of this stuff kind of going on, and that's kind of basically how pan works with this idea of a phantom center, right? We don't actually have a speaker right in front of us, so it's like we have two here and one here like a surround sound system does. So we're faking this. We're making it sound as though something is in the center because it's coming out of both speakers equally. If, of course, we adjust that, we change the pan a little bit, we start to put it to the left or the right, it's going to lower the volume in the other speaker by a certain amount, and it's going to make it sound as though it's coming out of this other speaker. Now, so we can have a lot of play time or a lot of ability with this. So, for example, let's go back into the drums here, and I'm just going to solo up our entire kit, and let's hit play. So if you can hear that, I'm actually moving the hi-hat around to kind of give you an example of that, of where we can place the hi-hat. So if I take the hi-hat down, we can hear it on our right side, right? So that's where it's coming from. It's there. But again, with this microphone, we can now accentuate and really, really place it in the stereo spectrum of where exactly we want someone to hear it. So let's bring the level up, and I've got it set for 60 to the right. So not 100%, but equal to the overheads that's picking up. So we can kind of place that hi-hat right there where we want it. Again, it doesn't take very much, just takes enough of it to kind of place it in there. So now let's go to the end here where he's kind of going on the ride, and we can work with that. Again, it doesn't take very much of that, but just enough to really kind of place it into position where we want it. So let's see. So let's look at what we've done so far. So we spread our rooms out because we just need to get that room sound. We've spread out our overheads, and now we spread out our hi-hat and our ride. The last two things we really have to spread are going to be our rack and our floor. So again, thinking about how if I'm looking at a drummer, the rack is probably going to be just a little bit, if I'm looking at the drummer, to their right side, and the floor tom is going to be on the opposite side, something like that. So now, let's go ahead and find this little spot right here with the toms. Put them back to mono. So it's okay in mono. I mean, they're there, but it is nice having some of that spread there. We just get that nice stereo spread that sounds like, we're listening to the drums in that specific space, and we can hear where the instruments are placed. So it's really, really important to start working with panning once we kind of have our levels set. And this can be a really fun thing because you don't have to follow any guidelines necessarily or rules. You can get crazy. There are some songs that I heard that I really, really enjoy that things are panned really weirdly, but it adds a cool vibe to things. So don't be afraid to mess with some of this stuff too. You don't have to follow the standard. Now, as we get into talking about standards, we have kick and snare, which typically we like in the center But this can also depend on how we mixed or how the song was recorded, how the drums were recorded. Because, for example, if you actually get behind a drum set, the snare drum usually isn't centered 100% in front of you with the kick. You typically play the snare off to the side a little bit with the kick in the center. So depending on how you mic the drums, like if you set your overheads directly over the drums, for example, like this, the snare drum would actually be closer to this overhead than it would be to this one. Now, granted, you want to align those as much as you can and make sure that the measurements are the same. But in essence, the snare's going to be closer to this one. So kick, snare, you think about here. So kick, snare, and our overheads. Now, if you adjust the overheads and you move them so that the kick and the snare are your center point, they're of course going to be centered up. So there's a few different ways on how to work this. So some people will actually pan their snares off to the side a little bit. So for example, if we just pan this off by say like 10%, let's see what that sounds like. Find a spot where he's actually you can hear I'm just messing around with the pan there a little bit to kind of give you an idea. But you can have some really fun stuff to do there. So we've got that pan. That's sounding great. Bass, again, it's mono and it's low end, so we like to keep it in the center. The last thing, of course, is our guitar. So let's jump back here to the beginning real quick. I mean, it sounds good like that when we're sitting there up the center, but we could technically take this off to the side a little bit. Now, just by changing that little bit, we only went 20%, but all of a sudden the guitar almost feels like it's a little further away from us, doesn't it? Like it's just a little bit further back. Not much. All we did was pan it just a little bit. I didn't change anything else, but we just tucked it back just a tiny, tiny bit. So now let's bring it in with everything so we can hear the whole thing. So again, that guitar, well, it's going to be different on your side, but you can kind of hear it's just off to one side, just a little bit, just a tiny, tiny bit. So again, all I did, I just panned it 20% right here. That's all we push it, just a little bit. If I can center it back up, we can listen to it. I'll bring it back to 20%. Okay, I really, really enjoy it right there. I like where it's sitting because there's some tricks that I particularly like to do when we start dealing with space, when we start dealing with time-based effects. So we're talking about reverbs, delays, flangers, phasers, choruses, etc. Anything that adjusts the time of things so we can start to add space. And now there's a specific reason I like to have it set here. Basically, I like to put the guitar into a space that we can hear. So I like to have things just slightly off. Even if it's 10%, it can make a huge difference because it just is out of center for us and kind of puts it into a new area of our listening. We're like, oh, like it's just a little bit, it's not quite center. And it makes us kind of visualize or think about the setup or what we'd be actually viewing. So in essence, we can see the drum set, we can see the bass player up there, and then all of a sudden we see the guitarist just off to the side. So this is really, really fun to do when we start getting into this. Now from here, I believe we're going to be jumping into some other stuff. Let me just double check to see. But yeah, we're going to start messing messing with buses and auxes next week and start dealing with like that with reverbs and delays and a little bit more space and panning, and start getting into playing with this kind of stuff. But this is a great start. Again, all we did, we basically adjusted the gain, adjust our levels basically, so that we weren't clipping on our master bus, and just everything kind of sounded balanced. And then we did some panning. So we went basically from just faders up, zeroed, to adjustments and some panning, and all of a sudden the mix just sounds a little bit bigger and wider just by doing these two basic things. So this is always the greatest place to start, because this will really start to tell you whether or not you are going to need EQ, and kind of where to start putting compression and where to start building your spaces for specific instruments, to just give you an overall idea of how you're going to build things. So when you're building a mix, definitely figure out what you're going to start with. Again, drums is typically where I start, but you can even start with vocals and build things around the vocals. It's all up to you. You can build a foundation, you can build your center point first, however you feel comfortable. But again, just go in and just start kind of messing with setting the levels of everything that sounds right, so that you can hear the detail of all of the instruments that you're working with. And then you can start panning them out and bringing out even more of that detail, and really brightening and shining things up with EQ and compression, etc., and start carving out space and really start honing in on that mix. So I hope this was informative for you. I hope this gives you a new way or a different way to start looking at building mixes and how to start getting into designing things that are going to work best for you. As always, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them down below. More than happy to answer anything that we can and help you out the best way that we can. Next week, we are going to be diving into how to start using auxes and busing, how to start putting on reverbs and effects and things like that, how to use this kind of stuff so we can start to enhance this mix a little bit more. Because again, we've set our gain, we've kind of set roughly like all of our panning and stuff, so now we can really start honing in. And we're going to basically take this little mix to the finish, and then we're going to look at maybe doing some other fun stuff with it as well. But that's pretty much what we've got planned up. So feel free to join us every Monday morning from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. as we dive deeper into mixing techniques and the reasons not only how to do it, but why you can do things, and hopefully we can help you along your audio journey. So enjoy the rest of the week or the day or evening or whatever time you happen to be checking out this video, and we will catch you guys next time. Thank you.